Hi everyone, and welcome back to Latin America Correspondent. I'm delighted to say that we're joined again today by regular guest Greg Gunter, who accompanies us from the magical town that is San Miguel de Allende in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, what might be considered Mexico's heartland region. And Greg is joining us, I'm happy to say, just on the cusp of one of Mexico's most important and unique celebrations, the Day of the Dead. Hello, Greg.
Buenos dias, John. Good to see you again.
Buenos, buenos dias to you too. Greg, I'm sure many listeners, regular followers of the broadcast and the podcast, are aware of the Day of the Dead. But for those who don't, I thought we might just give a little bit of a summary, just to clarify things a little bit. So, Day of the Dead takes place. The actual day is on the 2nd of November, but really its focus is the night before, the Night of the Dead, on 1st of November, when families come together to celebrate and honor those loved ones who have passed. It's a really beautiful ceremony and festival. Increasingly in Mexico, there are public events, but really they're quite new. At heart, the Day of the Dead is a private family affair taking place around an altar in the home, where photos of loved ones are placed alongside their favorite food and drink, and candles, marigolds, other offerings that sort of relate to that particular individual. It doesn't have to be a person either. Can be a pet, can be a variety of other sort of beings, I guess, which are no longer with us. And I guess that's a relevant point as well, because it's believed that the night of the dead, that the cusp of the 1st, the 2nd of November, is when the spirit world is closest to our world, and the sort of the barrier between the two is porous. I think the last thing I'd add is that one of the things that I've always really appreciated about Day of the Dead is that it sort of reminds us that in this sort of belief system, that actually death doesn't really happen, isn't an end, it's a passing through into another plane, and that closeness between loved ones is still very much possible. Greg, maybe we can just start with San Miguel. What does Day of the Dead look like in San Miguel de Allende? How does it manifest?
For those of you that kind of follow Mexican culture a little bit or are curious about it, you may have gotten a little bit of good insight into it with that movie Coco that Disney did a few years ago. That was a really kind of a cool insight. I'm not much of an animation fan, but I still had to watch it because I live in Mexico. So it was kind of fun to see it. And it gives you, it would help to have been in Mexico, I suppose, to have understood the movie a little bit better. But it was a very good and accurate, description of sort of how the Dia de los Muertos works. It's actually two days or two nights. They have, well, it goes during the day and night. So it's all day and all night for a couple of days. The first is supposed to be for children, and the second for adults. So it's interesting that they kind of break it out that way. But I've gone to visit, and hopefully maybe we can insert a few imagery, some great photos here as I speak. But I've gone myself to visit, just to experience, to see what it's like, and it's really a magical family event where the whole family will go. And first of all, the flower vendors will be set up outside the entry to the what they call the Pantheon, the cemetery. So you'll often buy flowers as you go in. And you'll see people carrying their picnic basket and a picnic table and a picnic blanket and a radio, and they go and they make it a whole day. They'll make it a picnic with grandpa or grandma, or whoever, Tio Lucas that has passed on, or whoever it is, and literally will take items that were precious to that loved one. So if he was a big fan of a particular brand of tequila, they take a bottle of that, and if he loved tamales, they take a plate of tamales, and they leave all this at their grave site. So it stays, and I guess the Pantheon eventually cleans it all up a couple of days later, but it'll stay for the couple of days during Dia de los Muertos, because the spirit supposedly has the opportunity to pass over into the physical world and enjoy these treats, and sort of in a way sort of communicate with the loved ones that are still alive. So it's really a touching experience to see as an American. We never do that kind of thing in the United States. Someone passes on, and maybe you visit the grave once a year very solemnly. And this is a very fun event. This is a very festive, people, give toast to their dead loved ones. They tell stories about them. They tell jokes about them. People will literally hire mariachi bands to come and play for the deceased one. So it's really kind of a festive, not solemn. We take death so solemnly in the United States. and maybe in Britain too, other parts of the world. I'm thinking they probably do as well. But this is a wonderful way of celebrating the loved one and their life, their accomplishments, what they did, once they have passed on. So it's really a fascinating event. Now you ask about San Miguel and how it kind of manifests specifically in San Miguel. So a lot of people have seen imagery online, videos, photos of what has become a different kind of event that's associated with Dia de los Muertos. It happens at the same time, and it's called the Katrina Parade. I'll give you a little history on that, or your viewers a little history on that. The 1910 revolution in Mexico was sort of mocked or mimicked by an artist called Posada. And he envisioned the upper class, the Mexican upper class, as very rich but soulless. And so to depict that soulless figure, he painted them or drew them as skeletons. But the women would be these long, elegant gowns and big chapeau hats, and they're all decorated up. And the men would be in tuxedos and have top hats, but they would be skeletons. That segued into what has become the Katrina Parade, and we've been doing it in San Miguel. I think San Miguel probably has the longest history of doing it for about the last 20 years. But to give you a little bit of a comparison, it had become so popular in San Miguel de Allende that one of the directors of the James Bond movie Spectre, who had been to San Miguel several times, I know him, loved the concept of that and decided to blow that up even larger in scale and incorporated that into the opening few minutes of the James Bond Spectre movie that was filmed in Mexico City. So that's a great, and the city loved it so much that they picked up that concept, and now the city supports that every year in Mexico City. And that's a grand event. That's almost like Mardi Gras. They've got large floats, big mechanical floats. Ours in San Miguel is very simple. People just go and get their faces painted up. They kind of wear something a little more elegant, something a little dark oftentimes, although it has segued into a more creative aspect. And so you'll see, and maybe I'll throw a couple of photos in here of some of the more creative Katrinas, and the men are called Katrines. You'll see a Marilyn Monroe, blonde with a red dress kind of, so that it's segued into something a little more creative, at least in San Miguel de Allende, but it's associated with Day of the Dead. So this year, for instance, it's November 2nd, the big parade, the Katrina Parade, they call it. Everyone gets their face painted and goes down to the Jardín, which is our town square, and kind of circles around the Jardín. And we all take big bags of candy because for the kids here, that's kind of their Halloween, at least here in San Miguel. So the kids will come and watch the parade, and it's really fun to do. I've done it many years, where you're parading around, and the people watching love to have their photo taken with you, especially if you've got a really creative one. Love to have your photo taken. I felt like a movie star every time I do it, because the grandmas want to have a photo, the families want the kids to have a photo with you, and you take a big bag of candy and you're throwing candy to the kids. So rather than them going door to door in San Miguel, they come and watch the Katrina Parade, and we throw 20 pounds of candy to the kids that are all around the Jardín. So it's really a fun family event. It's ironically not that many of the Mexicans do it. Some of the younger generation are beginning to follow and do that a little bit more, but they love to watch us gringos participate in it. Yeah, I mean, there's a fair number of Mexicans that do it as well. So I shouldn't make it sound like it's all an American thing, but it's certainly enjoyed maybe a little bit more by the Americans. If we have a parade of 400 or 500 people, probably 400 of that 500 are going to be Americans, or foreigners, I should say, that come down to participate.
Yeah, I guess whatever culture we're from, the things that we're born up and grow up with become a bit jaded over time. But I guess one of the things which has been a big draw for the Day of the Dead for an international audience, and certainly, as you say, I completely agree, for folk of an Anglo-Saxon background, is that it is a really refreshing take on death. So I completely understand why that sort of draws people to it. I also it's interesting what you say about the kind of this evolution of the Day of the Dead with its events, with its public events, how the Mexico City parade, which, as you say, is huge, sort of evolved, and how in the last, I guess, what we might term modern Mexico has begun to evolve these celebrations into being public. celebrations. It's also worth saying, I think, that the Day of the Dead also manifests very, very differently across different parts of Mexico, and actually extends into Central America. Down in the south of Mexico, in the Mayan world, for example, there are areas where the families get out the bones of the loved ones from a crypt, and then during that night, you say, whether they're at the cemetery, they're at the pantheon, they'll lovingly wash those bones. And often during the year, you'll be able to actually go and see those bones on full display. They're sort of, it's a very, what would seem to be gruesome to an Anglo-Saxon eye is actually just very present, a sort of a present continuity for the Mexica in particular, for Mexicans. Greg, just in terms of you, how do you alluded to this a little bit, but when you first came across Day of the Dead, how did was it in San Miguel? How did you relate to it? Because I always think it's interesting, that first sort of point of engagement with the festival and the celebration.
I really didn't know about it until I moved to San Miguel. I've lived here, by the way, full time since 2009. So I've been a full time expat here since, for 16 years, since 2009. I didn't really learn about it or know really much about it. I was like probably most Americans that come down from the States, or, that come from anywhere in the world, was a beach person. So I would visit San Miguel. I would visit Mexico as a vacationer on the beach in Cabo and Puerto Vallarta and places like that, Mazatlan and Acapulco, and just, spend a week on the beach and not really get too much into the culture. So once I actually moved to San Miguel de Allende and got into the culture and understood the history and, the cultural traditions, that's when I went. And it was probably used to be a big photographer. I loved taking photos. And so, my first year or two here, I would go, every year or two and take photos, because it's such a, I'll try to incorporate a few as we're talking here of the photos that I've taken that, really gave me a good sense of what it's like, and, what the family is like, and how they celebrate the loved ones that have passed on. Not quite the same tradition as you're saying in southern Mexico, but you're right. I think it's celebrated a little differently in different parts of Mexico. And one of the interesting things that you kind of mentioned earlier about how it's sort of evolved over the years, they didn't do this when I first moved here. Again, I've been here 16 years, but the last probably 8 or 9 years, the city now sponsors or hosts or allows people to set up altars in the Jardín, which is our town square. So you'll see, dozens of wonderful, gorgeous, they're like works of art that people will spend a day or two creating these phenomenal altars that are decorated with natural elements, lots of marigolds and coxcomb, and they'll create murals out of painted beans and flowers and corn, and it's a very gorgeous looking kind of display. And in many cases, they'll do tributes to old famous Mexicans, like Cantinflas, the actor. They seem to do one every year for Cantinflas. Maybe an ex-mayor might have one. Other famous Mexicans. Pedro Vargas, or I'm trying to think of some of the other, Mexican actors that are very well known. Even Luis Miguel, I think, he's not dead yet, but sometimes it seems like they did them to a number of different people. And same sort of thing, they'll have a bottle of beer out there, a bottle of, whatever they drank, and, they don't usually leave food behind, because that doesn't work too well they usually are up for a week, by the way. The altars here in town are usually up for about a week. But they're really a heartfelt tribute to these, loved ones that have passed on, or respected figures. As I say, not everyone knew Cantinflas, but everyone knows who he is. So it's always fun to see a kind of a tribute to him. And they'll have, old movie posters of him and old photos of him. And so it's really been a fun evolution of seeing how it has grown even larger in at least in San Miguel de Allende. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I would say probably in terms of, I don't really want to frame it this way as a kind of cultural export, but I think it's such a unique event and celebration that it's certainly one of the things which I think people around the world now know and associate with Mexico, because it is so sort of special and outstanding, really, in terms of how it sort of manifests. Greg, just in terms of, I think that, thinking about the sort of the annual calendar of celebrations and events, across Mexico, but specifically, of course, for you in San Miguel, where does Day of the Dead fit in terms of importance, and what would you say are the other sort of big sort of standout moments of the year where, of course, one of the joys of Mexico and Mexican culture is that it is so present on a day-to-day basis. So I don't want to sort of suggest that it only exists at certain celebrations during the year, but there are certain, I'd say, sort of standout moments where there's a particular kind of vibe or reference point. Maybe we could just draw some of those out and just give us a bit of context as to where Day of the Dead sits in amongst those other sort of important annual events.
And I love your comment about how Mexicans live in the day, in the moment. I joke with my clients that I think of Mexico as almost a very Buddhist environment because people live in the moment in Mexico. They truly live in the moment. Some of them because they never know when their next meal is going to come. So that little tortilla that they're having for lunch, they savor that tortilla and take an hour to eat that tortilla, and because they may not know when their next meal is going to be. So it comes from that level of, enjoy and appreciate every little thing that you have that you can be appreciative of. But back to the festival concept and the importance of them. It's interesting here in San Miguel de Allende. I don't know about other cities in Mexico, but in San Miguel de Allende, we have 75 official festivals, in other words, city sanctioned festivals, and another 75 kind of unofficial that might be a small neighborhood or a little indigenous, an old indigenous tribe that does a small celebration, just in their neighborhood or their colonia. So if you do the math, that's 150 days. That's like almost every other day we've got some sort of a small festival or a big one going on in Mexico. It's really wonderful. I would say Dia los Muertos probably ranks pretty highly, among those, among what you would think of as holidays, not so much of a festival. We don't think of Easter, for instance, as a festival, but Easter is the biggest one here in Mexico, in San Miguel de Allende. Certainly, I think that's true for all of Mexico. Easter is a full week or week and a half, of events that go on, parades, festivities also. It's a little more solemn, but nonetheless, it's still there are festivities around Easter, and that's certainly the biggest one. Christmas is also very big, but Dia de los Muertos, I would say, is big from a local family perspective. It's interesting that it's grown into more of a tourism based. In other words, people come down. I've got a group coming down, 25 people coming down next week to do a Dia de los Muertos kind of weekend event here. And, they wouldn't have done that probably 15 or 20 years ago. So it has become more of a draw for people coming down that, think of it as more of a festive sort of thing. And they're curious, maybe, to kind of want to learn about it. But it's definitely grown in popularity among, non-Mexicans and tourists wanting to come down and spend a little more time with it. So it's certainly up there. It's one of the bigger draws, of the 75 festivals. There's many of them that gringos don't even know about. They don't come down and visit for it. So I would say Dia de los Muertos from an international perspective has become much larger because literally people will fly down, just like I'm talking about my group coming down, to spend, the weekend and kind of enjoy the festivities, see the altars in town, learn more about the culture. It's kind of an educational group that comes down and wants to learn about the history and the culture. It's not quite the same as the beach crowd. I don't even know that they do this in Cabo San Lucas and places like that. But here it's a big tradition, so it has become much more of an international draw for people to come down, and certainly is one of the bigger festivals.
Interesting what you say, Greg, about this sort of Mexican notions of time, because I think that really ties in also with to Day of the Dead and other Mexican celebrations. But sometimes you'll sort of have this I think cultural clash in which people don't really understand. There's sort of a perception of lack of organization around time in Mexico, but that's because exactly what you referenced, because there's basically two senses of time. There's now, and there's ahorita, and there's later. There's at some point in the future, but that's never really distilled down. I mean, it's changed these days, of course, in the big cities and with business and um, melding into international markets and all those kinds of things. But at root, basically, a Mexican notion of time is those two, and there's nothing really sort of around that. And it's impossible to say when the ahorita, it's not people being cynical. It's just the fact that the sometime later is a really elastic term, which could mean in 2 minutes, could mean in 2 weeks, could mean maybe next year, potentially, if you're
We
particularly
we we
unlucky.
joke We joke, John. We joke, John, here in San Miguel in particular, because we're still a small provincial town, really. We're only 150,000 people. We're not a big city, so it really is sort of a like men still wear long pants. They don't wear shorts here. It's still a provincial town from that perspective. And so we joke with people that when people say mañana, when the handyman says, "Oh, I forgot to bring my hammer to," I know I was supposed to be hanging a photo, and of course that would mean hammering a nail into the wall, but I forgot to bring my hammer. I'll be back mañana with my hammer. That doesn't mean tomorrow. That means sometime in the future. You never know when mañana is going to be. So it's very
Yeah,
interesting. I think in the bigger cities, you're right. They have become more, I don't want to use the term westernized, but, more clock oriented, I would imagine. And that's less so here. People are a little bit more flexible from a scheduling perspective and a timely perspective. And the funny thing about me being a realtor, and I've got a lot of German traits. My last name is Gunter, as you've said. So I still have a lot of those German traits about, being on time to pick up my clients and get to the showing and all that kind of good stuff. And I'll make a turn down a little one-way street, and sure enough, there's a little parade going on that shut the street down for 10 minutes. And you just learn to live in the moment. So that's a fallback to that, your concept of living in the moment, living in the day to day. Mexicans are excellent at doing that. Us Americans are, I've lived here 16 years and I'm still adjusting to that. But it's a wonderful way to live your life down here. It's a very calming influence and a very tranquil kind of lifestyle to be able to enjoy that living in the moment.
absolutely. Very human-centered, I think. It's definitely not at
Yes.
root. It's definitely sort of not an industrialized. It's not a society which is focused on production and industrialized, which some people regard as negative. But the flip side of that coin, absolutely, is that the value of the moment, as you said before, and the value of human contact is really given primacy, and especially in the year 2025, I think that's incredibly refreshing. Greg, as ever, I want to say a big thank you for your time. I look forward to talking again soon, and yeah, thanks so much for giving us a little bit of a window into Day of the Dead in San Miguel.